Don't get too excited. So, who am I? I am Tana Tanoi. I'm a senior technical designer at Dinosaur Polo Club. So I've been there for like 7-8 years. I lost track of time a little bit. And I worked on updates for Mini Metro. I was there for basically the whole thing for Mini Motorways. And you can follow me on socials and stuff. Also, I'm director of my own studio, Dead Teapot. Just announced Shape Sander Deluxe like last week, which is pretty exciting. I'm obviously going to plug it while I'm here. Might as well. And you can come check it out at PAX or the NDBYOG later on this evening. Follow along. Please wish list the game if you liked the talk. If you didn't like the talk, wish list it anyway. I need those numbers. Thanks. But anyway, we're here to talk about Mini Metro and Mini Motorways and things that come out of that when you are trying to make a third game in that series. And a quick show of hands, who has played Mini Metro? Who's played Mini Motorways? All right, this is pretty easy. For the very few number of you who haven't played it, here's both trailers side by side at the same time. So what these games are about, for those who haven't played it, is getting people from A to B. In Mini Metro, you're using train lines, using trains that go on train lines. That's also useful. Trams, there's a Melbourne map. You can play that. And in Mini Motorways, you're doing a similar thing, but with cars and roads and traffic lights, that kind of thing. One thing I really liked is I remember a Eurogamer article. The author said that it was kind of like you're doing the same thing, but in different languages. And ever since that article came out, I say that all the time. It's really good. Makes it sound real fancy. So what we're covering in this talk is these 4 different bits. Some of it is kind of just context, so that when I explain other things, it makes more sense. And some of it should be broadly useful for anyone working within this kind of minimalist simulation genre. So firstly, I'm going to talk about how we define our specific type of minigame. That's real specific to us, but there'll be some useful learnings for everyone else as well. Mechanic first prototyping is the second thing I want to talk about, and that's basically just like a framework for how we do our prototyping. And it's just a set of guidelines because the word pillars was already taken. The third thing I want to talk about is what we've learned prototyping a third minigame. Again, there'll be some highly specific stuff and some very generally useful things. And the most general and useful part will be these new prototyping lenses, which, yeah, I say general, but I still mean specific to minimalist simulations. But anyway, let's get on with how we define mini-style games. So what is mini? I'm going to say minigame a lot, and to a lot of people that means like Mario Party, and for this it means Mini Metro, Mini Motorways, and anything else we make. And what I'll do is cover a couple of the design pillars I think are really impactful. First one is Wussel factor, then narrow player agency, and having a low barrier to entry. So what does Wussel factor mean? So it's a German word, and what it roughly translates to is kind of like teeming factor or bustling factor. And the way we like to think of it is it's a very specific type of game feel. And for a lot of people, like City Skylines and stuff, it'll be a thing they get because they're making simulation games. But for us, it's like number one game feel, the most important part. And we kind of define it as an increasing number of predictable agents making their way through a growing network. But it doesn't just have to mean that. We've also found, while we've been prototyping, is that you can get Wussel factor from just watching a single predictable agent navigate through a system. If it's interesting to watch, then it'll scale up well, that kind of thing. One of the things I did want to add, this is a real quick lesson right off the bat, is that this is a new revelation where we realized that it doesn't have to be lots and lots of agents, it can be just one, and the lesson there is to just always reaffirm what your pillars are by pushing those boundaries and seeing if it still works when you push them. The next pillar I want to talk about is narrow player agency. So what that means to us is that the player only controls a very narrow but a very critical part of the simulation. They're mainly just an observer for most of it. So in Mini Motorways, the player only controls the roads. They don't control where the buildings come from, where the houses are built, what car decides to go to what destination. But none of that would happen without them drawing the roads to make it happen. If we think of something like City Skylines, you have a massive breadth of control over the whole simulation. In Mini Metro, similarly, the player controls the trains and the train lines, but not the paths where the agents, not the path they take, where the stations appear or the geometry of the land, only a very narrow part of that simulation. Related to that is that we also want players to be making very small decisions, but lots of them. So every time they make a decision will be quite impactful on that simulation. So reiterating what I was saying before, the simulation can't run without the player's input, but it only takes a very small amount of input to get that simulation going. But one of the things we like, that's the more puzzly aspect of the game, is that the simulation running at all is not the same as the simulation running well. At any point they can delete all of their current solution, I guess, and then redraw all of their roads and see if that will perform better. One of the things we also like about this pillar is that it ensures that we as a company are contributing to making games that are accessible to all skill levels. We want people who are just casually interested in planes and cars to be able to play without having to know too much about how to run a city. But at the same time, we want to be able to allow puzzle enthusiasts to really dive into the nitty-gritty niche details of the simulation. And, you know, what happens if I put a traffic light here versus a roundabout, things like that. The third pillar I want to talk about is having a low barrier to entry. And this means, this is kind of like a catch-all for quite a lot of stuff that is present in the mini games. Firstly, it should be really easy to start playing. There shouldn't be many decisions to make to go from the main menu to playing the game. And one of the things we also like is that it gives a more reactive play style. Every time the game asks something of the player in order to continue, the player only has to make like a reactive decision. So they don't have to plan in this massive space where a building is going to go. A building is just going to appear and they will just connect it up because that's what's being asked of them. One of the things we also like is that it creates mostly simple decisions. So towards the start of the game, it's a pretty mindless, very simple, very still juicy and fun interactions that you're doing. And as you progress through the game, those decisions become more complex as they have more implications on your network. And all of these really contribute to having this calm to frantic arc that the minigames are famous for, where you're kind of playing and you're having a fun time and then you're like, what the fuck is going on? I don't know how to connect this new house. And similarly to the previous one, it also makes it open to all skill levels. It's not overwhelming to start a game, you can just get right into it. So both of these pillars contribute to having low cognitive load. And for us, this means that the player doesn't have to keep a lot of information in their brain in order to play the game. The entire game fits onto a single screen, and it's readable when it's paused. You can tell roughly what's going on. The UI isn't hidden behind nested menus, and we try to have as little text on screen as possible. Again, all of this contributes to the player just having a real chill experience that doesn't require a lot of brain space to play and engage with. So with that covered off, I want to go into mechanic-first prototyping. And the way I like to describe how we do this is talking about these two different guidelines that we have. The first of which is simulation first. It's not a thing that's going to work for every style of game, and I'll explain why. It's kind of like a programmer way to make games, admittedly, but the gist of it is that we try to avoid too much of the visual and audio game feel, like sounds and art and animations or polish or things like that. And we want the rewarding aspects of the game to come purely from the way you interact with the game or the woosel factor. So like I was saying before, woosel factor is like right at the top and everything else is kind of secondary to that. Effectively what we're doing is we're asking ourselves, is the simulation fun in its most fundamental form? So you can kind of see that this is a very, very early GIF of one of the early Motorways prototypes. I'll go into detail on that later, actually. So, secondly, the idea is that if the game is fun enough in its most bare bones simulation, a bunch of squares running around rectangles, then it'll be pretty amazing once we add art and animations and sound and everything else. In the prototypes, we just make fixed levels. We don't really do any procedural generation, because that way it lets us craft this perfect experience of what we want to have when we eventually get to pre-production and start doing actual procedural generation of the levels. And we also just know that's something we can sort out later. We know how to do it, we've done it before. And so we don't really have to prototype it early, and we can focus our time on making the rest of the game fun. The second guideline is make the toy, and this one isn't particularly new, but I wanted to include it for completeness. And the way it manifests for us is that we just want to make a game that's fun to play, and then make the rest of the game later. We don't program the metagame, we don't add upgrades or obstacles, or we don't really go too late we're deep into the late game. And in some ways, this can even include just doing very muted, basic versions of really core mechanics. For example, in a lot of the prototypes we've done for Motorways and future games, we haven't fully implemented all of the pathfinding, but it kind of doesn't matter as long as they're getting on a vehicle and then going somewhere else and then getting off. Similarly, Mini Metro in the Game Jam version, it didn't have rivers or upgrades. It was just about connecting stations and watching agents get on a train and get off somewhere else. Ultimately, the goal is to make something that's unrestrained and fun, and then constrain it to make the problem space more interesting. If you're struggling to make it interesting without adding constraints, then maybe you just need to go back to the toy and find what that fun little toy box is. So with these two guidelines in place, I want to kind of go through a couple of the different prototypes of Mini Motorways. So this is a document that is like a short summary of every single prototype we did. We did like 20-something prototypes for Mini Motorways. And I'm not going to go into every single one. Actually, a previous GCAP talk I did, it's online, it's on my website, I think. That goes into every single one in detail if you're interested in finding out more about that one. But to start off, I thought I'd go back to this one I kind of alluded to earlier. And Mini Motorways was initially designed to merge the game Freeways with Mini Metro. So that's kind of where we started. We started with the cars of Freeways, and eventually we worked out they're very different games and don't merge as perfectly as we thought. And this is an example of us making the toy and making the simulation first. So we don't have any car sprites, we don't have any animations or audio, but it's still fun to watch boxes go around on other boxes. There's no real goal in this. There's no way to win, there's no way to lose. But we know that drawing a road and watching cars go around is pretty cool. There's 5 different variations of this one that we were trying out. And one of the funny things we encountered with this one was that you could just keep adding roundabouts. And every time you added a roundabout and more stuff spawned in, you would just add another roundabout. And cities don't really look like that, so it wasn't quite the vibe. Additionally, the input was a bit finicky because you had to... It was one-way roads, so if they didn't have a path back, then it would kind of jam up the network for no reason. And then, it just didn't quite work for us. Another one that didn't work, but is fun to talk about, is this one that used real map data. So you would draw a path, and then, again, it looks really ugly because simulation first. You would draw a path, and then roads based on real map data would appear, and then there's little dots running around the screen now, I think, that you kind of have to optimize their routes. Yeah, this one was really finicky and a bit odd. It didn't evolve seamlessly in the way that we wanted it to. And it also didn't feel like you were building your own city. It felt like the city was already there and you're just discovering it, which is cool. I'm sure someone else could do a game like that and it'd be sweet. And this is like the last set of prototypes where it started clicking into place. We put the roads onto a tile system, and the cars would just go from house to house, and new houses would spawn in over the map, and it's kind of, I just described Mini Motorways, so that's pretty close. We did end up we cheated the rule, and I'll talk about more of this later, that we did add like upgrades and things like that. But one of the things we got out of this was there was way less decision paralysis when you knew that it was all tile-based, so you didn't have this free-form road drawing where it was going to have 10% more concrete or whatever. This was, you have 10 tiles, there's a 10 tile distance, you can make that distance. Another thing we got out of this is that it's symmetric, so if they can go from A to B, they can go to B to A, and that fixed a bunch of problems. Yeah, it was just easy and fun, and this is where we had a toy that was just fun and it looked like a city. And it started evolving further into new ones like this. So this is where we really started diving into the vertical slice. This one, it's not just putting down a whole tile, you're adding connections, you're adding edges between nodes. It's juicy animations. And the idea is that little zoned areas would pop up, and if you drew a road next to it, that would create a building there. And then there was like something about regions. I don't entirely remember all the details about this one, where different regions had to go to different places. But the main thing I want to communicate through these sections is that all of this, this idea of just, we have a fun toy, so let's just make the rest, find out what the rest of the game is. As you can very clearly see that. And this one is where it really starts looking like Mini Motorways today. Yeah, so we were just kind of going through the vertical slice, trying to find out what other questions we had remaining to answer. So one of those is like, how does the mobile controls work? And what other kind of upgrades can we put in? So there's a couple of differences here relative to motorways today, which is, so there's these car parks that would kind of get bigger over time, and they would fill up. But it's roughly the same game. But another part I wanted to reiterate here is that finding the toy isn't particularly easy. It took us 4 months to just play with the toy, and then 4 months from that tile one to this, of just iterating on the vertical slice. But once you've got a solid toy, you've always got something to come back to. You always know, if I draw a road and put cars down, it's going to be at least interesting to look at. So kind of through these prototypes, what I wanted to showcase was that there's a very clear differentiation between this toy phase and the vertical slice phase. The toy has a mechanic and it has a simulation, and we want to find out if that was fun. And then the vertical slice is finding the rest of the game, the metagame, the upgrades, the different constraints we want to put on, the ways we can vary the levels, things like that. And different mechanics came and went through the different iterations, like there was the one with the zoning, which we scrapped, and there was one where motorways would cost concrete as you built and things like that. But we always knew that draw a road, car drives on it, car go burr, it's fun to look at. And having that kind of guiding light of this is what the core game is about really helps do everything else. And it's just a really helpful lens for a small developer for us to make simple, accessible games. So we always are ensuring that our toy is always fun is really important to us. And another big learning is that how this process is different when you don't have an explicit idea of what the game is. So with Mini Motorways, there's a little backstory. It was basically, hey guys, we're making a car game. Let's find out what that is. Whereas now that we're making the third game, we're just like, well, we need a third mini game. Don't know what the theme is. And suddenly you've got like a bunch of different toys, and you're not sure which one is working, which one is what you want, which one is what players want. And I don't think I have concrete decisions on this one. We're still kind of going through this at the moment. But one of the things we definitely learned is that it's very easy to make toys for this kind of game. I'm taking that back the moment that I said it. It's easy to make not very good toys for this game, and then comparing them is very difficult, comparing which one you want to do, which one, how far should you take it into the vertical slice, things like that. But I think having this framework of toy versus vertical slice is very useful for knowing, even vertical slice isn't the right term, because that could be like pre-production, finding out how long it takes to make one level, things like that. Now, let's just move on. So keep all of this stuff in your mind as we go into this third section, which is lessons that we've had for prototyping the third game. Title slide again, didn't need that one. Anyway, how we started making a third game looked something like this. It's pretty standard process, but we gathered prompts from the entire team, so we had these giant brainstorms. We broke everyone down into little groups so it wasn't intimidating, and they would come in, and then they would just yell at us and go, bees, and we're like, cool. What's the game? That came up, I think, in most of the sessions. Someone would say bees at some point. I don't know. Maybe we'll work it out one day. After that, we write the different ideas that we've got into actual feasible game pitches. Like elevator pitches we could make. We got to about 16 after gathering the massive list of just whatever things people were saying in a 2-hour meeting. Then we kind of developed those into shorter pitches, which we could actually feasibly implement and prototype, and that got us to about 7. Some of those we cut, not because the game was bad, because it just didn't fit with our company. So some of them were actually genuinely cool games that I'm sure we could execute, but it felt weird to make like a hyper-capitalist game as DPC. But that's like a studio thing as opposed to a game design thing. And then we started making the toys. And that's what this next section is going to be about. Surprise, surprise. So, it shouldn't be a surprise that we're working on a third minigame. We make games, we're a game studio. Let's go on to the first one. We did the most obvious thing first, which is Mini Airways. There is a game on Steam called Mini Airways. That wasn't us. They definitely took some inspiration from us, though, and that's cool. Anyway, it's Mini Metro with planes. Thematically, works the exact same way as Mini Metro does. Yeah. I really should have got some better GIFs. I don't know why I put the one on the top right with Christ the Redeemer moving around. But I'm reiterating, simulation first. Oh God. Anyway, so we didn't want to just make Mini Metro 2. We wanted to put our own spin on it. So we took its similarity to Mini Metro as a boon. So we're like, well, we could, put a fresh spin on it, add some new mechanics. And maybe this is immediately going against the guidelines we just said before. But like Mini Metro had a couple of problems that we wanted to try and solve. One of them is if you've got an overcrowding station and you draw from that station to somewhere else, a train will pick up those passengers and immediately alleviate. This is like high-level, top-tier player strats. We just don't like them. And then you'll stop game overing on that station. And so we're like, oh, well, we can address that in the next one. So we had this whole concept of you have like a plane depot, what are they called? Air hangars or something. And when you create a new route, they would have to leave from that, which creates this like diegetic loading bar until your route is available and ready to go, which somewhat solves that problem. Yeah, that's what that one's about. And then we had like the whole mechanic of like having the different planes colors here are different sizes. So you've got like small domestic planes, big international planes, things like that. And this didn't quite work. What did we learn from that? So as I alluded to, those extra mechanics don't really matter. Ultimately, we found that the game was just way too similar to Mini Metro. It just felt like you were just doing the same thing. Even though there was new mechanics and new ways to interact with the game, you just did. If you described what you did in both games, it would be exactly the same. And if, like we were talking about earlier, when I was talking about Mini Metro and Mini Motorways having this different language, it didn't feel like they were different languages. The exact same language, doing basically the same thing. And that is because the player's interaction is the same. And so, we very quickly learned that whatever new game we make has to have a new interaction method. We know that in isolation from Mini Metro, Mini Airways would be a great game. People would love it. Anytime anyone's like, what's the next game? Mini Airways is always the first thing people guess. I think we've called it like the Apple Watch of DPC. Niche joke. Yeah, so what did we make next? We did the fourth thing. After Mini Airways, it's Mini Marina. It's Mini Metro with boats. But what we were doing differently with this is that we had free-form route drawing. So instead of, you would still drag from a point to point, but you can see these little pink handles, and you could pick up one of those and change the route that boat would take. We had this whole idea we would have like ocean currents, so you could slightly adjust where the route goes, and it would make the most of an ocean current where they would speed up the boat and get people or cargo places faster, something like that. And aspects of this was neat, but damn, It really just felt like Mini Metro again. And we didn't even implement the ocean currents because, again, coming back to that make the toy first part, the toy was, still the same as Mini Metro. We were just really reminded that having those extra mechanics really doesn't make it feel fresh. So, yeah, what we learned from this is that we needed a new simulation and a new input method. Doing a different input to accomplish the same task just felt exactly the same. Having the same underlying goals was just way too similar. So from that, we went into Mini Mail. We're keeping with the M theme and doing our best. The idea here is that you would have these vans that would pick up packages from a depot and then drop them off around the neighborhood. So you can see we're reusing that freeform route drawing, but now it's constrained to the streets of a city. Draw mail routes, you can edit routes on the fly, and then vans had limited capacity so that they would have to return to the depot, and the way you optimized your routes would allow that to be better or worse. It was a prototype where the players just had to solve the traveling salesperson problem that constantly changes. And this was actually, we're not making it, but we did learn a lot from making the prototype. The first thing is that we can make something that's not Mini Metro. That was cool. And yeah, because we had a different input method and a different goal, it felt like an entirely different game. It still had all of the same iconography and the vibes of the previous games, but it felt new and fresh, which was cool. The reason we didn't really go with it is that the agents, we didn't have that woosel factor. I've already said woosel factor is right at the top in terms of importance, and this didn't have it because the agents weren't autonomous and self-directed. They were kind of like, you just told them where to go and they would do that, and that wasn't nearly as interesting. So, yeah, I've kind of been alluding to this, is how did this mechanic-first prototyping pan out while we've been prototyping a third game? So I want to revisit what they were talking about there and just very clearly state the lessons learned and audience takeaways. Looking back on simulation first, skipping game feel and polish in general is a good idea for prototypes in terms of making the most of your time, making sure you're not blinding your players with flashy stuff that hides all of the problems with the game design. You don't really want to spend all of that time on a prototype that might not be fun at its core. But game feel is really important, actually. So you really should not be skipping any of this on your core mechanics. Your games absolutely should have game feel. You don't have to do a little button bouncing around when you click on it, but you really do need to have your core mechanics be polished, even if you've got woosel factor or some other kind of game feel that is being derived from your simulation. And like I alluded to earlier, I wasn't even following this with Mini Motorways. The first prototype that convinced people that, oh yeah, this is a good idea, it had little sounds when you draw a road. It had little animations where they'd pop in. I don't think that fully made people ignore any problems with it. They could still see there was issues to solve, but it definitely helps in selling the game to your team as well. It is a balance. Don't wow people with your flashy visuals and no gameplay, but that'll set up false expectations for your team, but you do need to have a cool interaction and a fun simulation. And lastly, this pillar shouldn't be used as a way to not include other disciplines early on. That's probably a whole talk on its own, but in short, we didn't have art capacity, as you can tell, in the early prototypes. And that meant not just that they weren't pretty, but it also meant that we didn't have artist brains pushing back on us designers and making sure that we're making something that's going to work for both departments. Programming team can just deal with it. I'm a tech designer, I can say that. Anyway, make the toy. This actually worked pretty well. I think, on the whole, I would say this is still pretty solid as a way to plan out your prototyping process. The only thing I was going to add to this is that if constraints are part of your core gameplay, if like resource management is really important, then that's fine. You don't have to fully skip it. Even just like having the awareness of resource constraint can change how someone feels about a game. Even if it's not properly balanced, where like, as an example, if Mini Motorways, you had 100 roads right from the start, knowing that you would run out eventually, I think still helps. And one of the other parts I will quickly add that I forgot to say earlier is that you do need to treat your toy phase and your exploration phase very differently in your production processes. It's very difficult to have sprints about making toys because it's such a flowy, exploration-y state. You can start doing that a bit more as you get into like the vertically slicey parts, but it's hard. It's a balancing act. Everyone's going to do it differently. So the last section I want to talk about is some of the prototyping lenses that we've picked up as we've been prototyping the third game. And these are just pulled from different places, different talks I've done. And I'm sure everyone has their own little variations of how they do this, but it's nice to have a shared language for how you talk about it with other people. So the first one is moment-driven gameplay. And the idea is pretty simple. You just kind of ask yourself, what moments do you want these systems to create for your players to have? This might come from what feeling do you want them to have? What whimsical interaction do you want them to have? Or like a one that's talked about a lot is like in puzzle games, having the aha moment. Driving your gameplay around these moments is a really good way to have a shared vision. And I'll just explain it more with more pictures. So it comes from a GEC talk I saw a few years ago about a third-person arena skate action game called Rollerdrome, which rules, play Rollerdrome. The level designer, Jacob Mills, was talking about how before the game entered production, or before it was even picked up by a publisher, they had these viral tweets on Twitter that was showcasing some very specific maneuvers that you could do that looked really awesome. But it was all just in like a gray box level to just prove this concept of like shooting guns while roller skating is sick. And like these moments and their viral moments on Twitter is one of the reasons it actually got picked up altogether. So what they did is part of the level design brief for each level is that different levels were assigned some of these GIFs from way back when, and they wanted that to occur specifically in that level. And like you can't force these moments to happen in like an open arena style game, but you can definitely incentivize it, and that's pretty cool. And similarly in our games, our systems, we're not making like a linear action adventure game with cutscenes and things like that, so we can't pull moments from the narrative or things like that. But we can create systems that design the moments that are designed to create specific moments. As an example in Mini Motorways, this is from the latest update with trains, where we wanted a moment to happen where the cars would stop for a train and players would go, wow, they're interacting. We'd probably have a better description of that moment somewhere. We didn't really have this moment-driven mentality, gameplay mentality, when we're in like the prototyping or pre-production stage for Mini Motorways. But as I mentioned earlier, we had like the make the toys stuff going on, which I think did parts of what this concept is trying to do. So with this whole moment thing, the train moment or car stopping for it, we visually knew how we wanted it to look. We wanted the cars to slow down as they approach the thing, as they see an approaching train, then start to speed up as they go past it afterwards. And we like tweaked a lot of the balance to make this happen. So we made the stopping distance for a car much wider than if it was in real life, because our trains are really short. They're only 3 carriages long. Whereas, if you're stopping for a train in real life, you're going to be sitting there for a couple of minutes as it goes by. So we really don't have a lot of time in which a car would actually be stopped if it was running at maximum efficiency. And while we've been prototyping using this lens, it's been really helpful to ensure that we're creating systems that will drive the moments that we want. Even if we don't explicitly have like a full design doc or a spec yet, having these moments is a really great way to capture that and have a very tangible shared vision. So yeah, how do we design moments in a systemic game? And it kind of boils down to a handful of steps that are going to be different for everyone, unfortunately, but this is what we do. We decide the moments that we want. So it could be what emotion, like I said earlier, it could be the emotions that you want a player to feel, and when you want them to feel, and how, what moment in your game will make those emotions happen. You have to tweak your system to allow these moments to happen. Tweak the values, tweak the speeds, tweak widths, all of the balance that you can in order to make it happen the way you want it to happen. If we didn't balance the cars to stop for the trains in the way we wanted, it's likely that the trains wouldn't even have had an impact on the simulation at all, apart from looking cool. And thirdly, guide your players towards where those moments happen. So constrain the player if you need to. Make a moment unavoidable in any direction. With the trains, we have like we place the starting camera on top of a train line, and then we put a house and a destination on the opposite side to just force these cars to have to go over the rails and stop for this train at some point. So we design the whole thing to make this moment happen. And then playtest it. Yeah, that's really important. Watch your playtesters' emotions, see that they are reacting in the way that you wanted them to. Asking questions helps, but that's not going to capture everything. People have done better talks about playtesting than you'll get from me in 2 minutes. So the next prototyping lens, that previous one's good for lots of games. This one's, again, very specific to designing minimalist simulations. And yeah, tutorial-driven design. So if you remember earlier when I was talking about this narrow slice of agency, thinking about the tutorial as you're designing the rest of the game is a really nice way to determine the scope and the cognitive load of a mechanic as you're constantly thinking about what will I have to explain. Gotta do the alliteration. Mini Metro famously had these wordless tutorials like you can see in the top right. And Mini Motorways had very short text descriptions. We use this lens for creating mechanics to decide if the complexity is beyond what we want for the game. And we have a little process. We haven't written it down, but everyone knows the process for how we decide that. So let's say we've got a cool mechanic or a system that's interesting and elegant, and it's fun to play with if we added it to the game. We kind of run through this little list. So we look at skeuomorphism, we try and tutorialize it textlessly, we then try see if we can do it in a short sentence, and I'll just go into these in more detail. So skeuomorphism, who's familiar with the term skeuomorphic design? Yeah, it's kind of like how much real-world familiarity and knowledge can you use in your design. We really heavily try and rely on real-world knowledge as much as we can. Players know that a car can drive, and it drives on a road, and that a train goes on a track. So that's a lot of things that we don't have to explain. We don't even have to tutorialize at all if, like, you know, oh, I've got a bridge, oh, there's water. Bridges go on water. And we use this in our iconography as well. So you can see the game's pin iconography. We kind of took that from Google Maps, where on Google Maps it represents like a destination or a location, and that's just derived from having a physical pin on a physical map, meaning some, I guess, well, it depends on who's doing it, but traditionally, I guess, means like a location of importance. So if we can't do that, we'll go into having wordless tutorials. Inconsistent, I wrote textless tutorials before. But yeah, can we suggest how something works with indicators and simple UI? In real life, it turns out you can't just create train lines by dragging your finger. So we can't exactly use skeuomorphism for that. But what we can do is make the most of these little indicators, which are indicating, hey, you should drag from this point to this point. and then relying on the fact that players understand that lines go between subway stations, which is where we're taking our iconography from. It'll just gently ask you to do this thing, and you'll hopefully work out the rest. And if we can't do it completely wordlessly, we'll do it with a short text snippet. And our rule of thumb is if we can't explain it in less than a sentence, we probably shouldn't put it in the game. In Mini Motorways, we use these little texts to explain or reinforce previous mechanics that we use the other methods for. But for really gamey things, we just tend to explain it with text. So in this one here, it's like when you collect a pin, you will get a point. But yeah, like I said, if we find that it takes more than one sentence to be able to explain to a player how a mechanic works and then for them to be able to utilize it, it's probably too complicated for our game, or the design is too difficult. And we'll just either change the system or really, really question, does it need to be in the game? This methodology of using a tutorial as a way to scope the complexity of the game design has really worked with us while we've been prototyping. We would have this cool idea for how a system might work, and it's elegant and well designed, and typically some of the examples I'm thinking of in my brain is that it'll have lots of complexity. That seems counterintuitive, but it lets you play differently is what I'm trying to get to. But the moment we would try to explain this design in a single sentence, we're like, maybe it's too complex. And this comes back to what I was talking about earlier about low cognitive load. Because ultimately, we don't want elegant design to come at the cost of a higher cognitive load or a higher barrier to entry. And that brings us to the tail end of the talk. We covered a lot of things today, actually. We talked about making the toy, making the simulation. We talked about how this lets you have a really solid foundation for how to find the fun in your game. We talked about deciding on moments and how you drive your system to create those moments. I explained a couple of different Mini Motorways prototypes, so you can kind of see that in action. And we talked about how using a tutorial as a lens for minimalism really works as a way to scope down your design. And hopefully something was useful or interesting. And if not, you got to see a couple of boxes run around a screen. Thanks. If anyone has any questions, we've got some time for it. If you have one, just come up to the microphone and let me know.
I have one. Thank you. Thank you for talking today. You're very carefully skirted around what your third game is going to be.
You're right. I did skirt around what the third game is going to be.
Okay, that's fine. But thank you.
It's not any of the four that I showed. Any other questions?
Sorry. So with each prototype that you're working on, do you guys set a max time that you might work on it, before you decide to move on to something else?
We should. So the question was, do we, time box our prototypes? And it's a weird one. So at the start, we were going, oh yeah, we can put out a prototype every week. And then we hit this point where it's like, this one's really good, I think. And so we'd put another week on, put another week on, put another week on. It's been 4 months. You should, especially if you don't have Apple Arcade money. But we're in a very privileged position to be able to spend time and really perfect what our prototypes are. My other piece of advice on that is sometimes you just know when you've got something and you just need to dig a little more. And sometimes you just know it's not that good and you should move on to the next thing. I could probably talk another 10 minutes about that.
Hi. So I know this was a talk about prototypes, but I am sort of curious if you can answer. At what point do you start thinking about later gameplay, emergent gameplay, or the end game, or do you just really let the toy take itself to the logical conclusion.
Yeah, so the question is about when do we add the rest of the game, the meta game, the late game. We are always thinking about it. We're always like, oh yeah, this could work in this way to make this happen. One of the things we always say about mini games is that they're always really, all the design is really intermingled. So the moment you change one thing, it's going to change every other and cascade every other system because, people think minimalist design might be easy because there's less stuff. But when you have less stuff, all of it has to be perfect. So one of the things we found is that when we have a fun toy, we then have to think about what we want the game over to look like. And then we have to integrate the toy and the game over very tightly. To answer the question in short, we're always thinking about it, but once we hit the vertical slice is when we implement and make sure it works and feels good and hits the time that we want. Typically, there are other things that are going into the decision making for how that's designed. A quick example is game over, is that we typically want a game to last 10 to 15 minutes so that someone can play it on their commute.
Cool, thank you.
Hi. So one of your points was like leaving more complex upgrades and features to like do that later on and just keep it simple at the start. Is there any like features that you were intending on adding later on and then decided against later on, and why?
That's a good question. In short, it's kind of, is there anything that was cut?
Yeah.
Yes. It's not exactly a mechanic, but one of the moments I really wanted for Mini Motorways that we didn't have time to implement, and if we implemented now would change the entire balance of the game because, again, they're all very tightly interlinked, is when you've got like a queue of cars and they start moving again, they do that little snake thing where, hopefully people know what I'm talking about with the traffic snaking.
Like traffic, yeah.
Yeah. And that's not something we got to implement because autonomous car calculations for acceleration is complex and we didn't have a lot of time.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I was curious to hear about non-digital prototypes. What role do paper prototypes play? Do you have anything that looks like a board game or a card game at any point?
So, the question is about paper prototyping. Do we do that? Absolutely. Paper prototyping rules. The game we are making, that I'm not going to talk about, the first time we were like, oh, this slaps, was when we were playing it on a whiteboard, where I was playing the player and the other person was playing the computer. So, I'm rambling again, but one of the design ways we like to design our games is we have this idea of having a question and having an answer. So what is the game asking of a player, and how does the player get to respond to that? Which translates very well to playing on a whiteboard, because the person will like draw up, oh, this is the thing you've got to do, and then I will answer that by placing this and placing that, really choosing my words carefully. And then you can just continue to iterate like that. It does fall apart for our types of games because after a certain point, for example, if we had Mini Motorways, after a certain point, you can't exactly perfectly simulate a bunch of cars moving around the simulation. You kind of just have to role play it like a TTRPG, where it's like, there's a traffic jam here now, what are you going to do about it? But yeah, paper prototype's really good. I think we have time for one or two more questions, yeah? Depends on how much I ramble.
Thank you for the talk. I think one of the key points you brought up was that at some point of the iterations, you figured out that some of the games weren't in line with the studio values, and I'm wondering, like, was that a very quick decision, or is that something that was talked between the team for a long time before you decide to kind of snip on certain ideas?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's about how do we decide when to cut a game based on studio values. And we often joke, like, DPC is not going to make an action horror game. We made 2 traffic games, so it'd be a weird jump. But once you get into the stuff that is in the gray area, that's where it's a bit more difficult. And actually, the game we are making is something we initially cut, and I was like, oh, I still think it's a really good game, so I'm just gonna like spend a week and quickly prototype it. And then we did, and it ruled, and so we kept making it. But it's not a easy decision, and it's a lot of discussion. Sometimes you do just know, but other times less so. We have 1 minute if we're quick, or we can go get lunch. Yeah? Lunch? All right. Thanks for coming.